Hello, this is Darko 2012. I'm reading an article posted on Infowars.com by Kurt Nimmo titled Former Microsoft Tech Officer Suggests Crackpot Terraform Idea to Save the Planet. They're talking about chemtrailing here. I'm going to read what's written here and then I'll show the video. Nathan Myhrvold has an idea. He says he will save us from the theory of global warming. Myhrvold, a former technology officer for Microsoft, wants to run a hose tethered by balloons up into the stratosphere and pump out sulfur particles to block the sun. Mr. Myhrvold says his scheme will not kick off another ice age. It will only cost about 250 million and will not require a global tax or world government. And let's go and check out what he has to say.
And of course, one of your ideas is the stratoshield,
Yeah.
which we talked about here today. What is that?
So our stratoshield idea is an invention that is aimed at saying, what if our efforts to cut CO2 emissions through conservation, alternative energy, so forth, are too little too late? What if the stuff hits the fan and it starts getting too hot? Now, the problem with global warming is once something starts getting too hot, guess what? You have another 100 years of it because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a very long time. So we came up with stratoshield as a way of saying, how could you, on an emergency basis, cool the Earth? And we think it's a simple, relatively cost-effective, pretty practical way that you could intervene and cool Earth off enough to prevent disaster.
And the idea is essentially to put sulfur into the stratosphere. And how would you do that?
So we need to put sulfur particles or some other particle up into the stratosphere, so about 25 kilometers up. In order to do that, we have engineered a system of balloons and hoses. So we literally run a hose to the sky. And our calculations show it's not that big a hose. It's 2 inches in diameter, so it's like a sort of a hefty version of a garden hose. And if we can run that garden hose up to the sky and have the system all working appropriately, we can deliver enough particulate matter to dim the sun in a way you'd never actually see, but you'd make the sun slightly a percent dimmer than it is today. Not even noticeable, but enough that it would erase global warming. And it would allow us to have a normal climate as opposed to the climate that I'm afraid we're going to have if we keep having CO2 emissions run unchecked.
And what about potential negative implications of that sulfur?
So the same kind of sulfur, the reason we've chosen sulfur as the material, we could choose lots of other materials, but sulfur is entirely natural. It's put up by volcanoes. Actually, some sulfur dioxide emissions come directly from the ocean. Some come from other kinds of human technology. So we would be putting less than 1% of what the sulfur that's already in the atmosphere up there. Now, that's important because we know what the impact is. A new material that we would try to qualify, you'd have to wonder, is there a long-term influence we don't know? Is there some unintended consequence of that? You know, you don't want to fix the unintended consequence of CO2 with another unintended consequence. In this case, because sulfur dioxide has been emitted by volcanoes for 4 billion years, we have a pretty good idea as to what it does. And look, I prefer not to do it. I prefer we weren't in this pickle, but we seem to be, and our political and diplomatic efforts to get out of the problem so far aren't getting any traction.
Well, there you go, everybody. That was what he had to say about it. Just finishing it off, this article. It says sulfur occurs naturally in the environment. He points out so his balloon and hose scheme would not endanger the environment. The amount he estimates is needed to do the job is relatively small, less than 1% of the sulfur already in the atmosphere. He had another terraforming idea a while back. He said he could prevent hurricanes through a system that would literally mix up the water in the Gulf of Mexico and other areas vulnerable to tropical storms. We already remember that. Earlier this year, the Obama administration proposed shooting pollution particles into the upper atmosphere to reflect the sun's rays, an idea proposed by Council on Foreign Relations. Obama's so-called science advisor and unabashed eugenicist, John P. Holdren, uh, said he is in favor of an artificial volcano that would pump sulfur into the atmosphere and block the sun. Despite Holdren's admission that such measures could have grave side effects, he added, "We might get desperate enough to want to use it." The CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, admits such crackpot ideas are merely a pretext to establish a global carbon tax and ultimately world government. A CFR geo-engineering meeting summary document from 1999 also categorically states that the ultimate goal under a technology strategy for global warming is the implementation of a global carbon tax, writes Steve Watson. The memo also pedantically explains how the perceived fear of global warming can be used to sell to Americans what is essentially a tax on air. Finishing up here from the CFR document, while taxing tea pales in comparison to taxing air as perceived government affront, the clear benefits of a taxation policy to combat global warming might convince even the descendants of our tax-resistant founding fathers. In fact, many of the descendants of our tax-resistant founding fathers are up in arms over the CRU revelations and the threat to shut down economies, bankrupt nations, and exacerbate the problems of the third world by implementing draconian policies in the name of global warming. Leaders of the third world nations were outraged and walked out of the Copenhagen summit earlier this month when a draft agreement was leaked revealing how rich nations or the elite in the country in control of these nations plan to use the climate change ruse of consolidate power and sideline the United Nations. The so-called Danish text spelled out a scheme to further empower the World Bank and IMF. The crackpot theories of Nathan Myhrvold and others associated with Holdren are merely a circus sideshow attraction designed to sell the ideas of a worldwide totalitarian government implementing radical social and scientific theories. So, there you have it. I guess the biggest thing that I saw in that and what this Nathan Myhrvold was saying was that they keep him and like John P. Holdren, the director of science and technology. They say they talk about this stuff, and they usually use sulfur. That's the particle that when chemtrailing is admitted, or terraforming the planet, or any kind of weather modification, it's always sulfur. Like I wrote a story titled "Chemtrails Do Not Exist, but they exist," and it was documenting all of the it was all within a 1 month period. The Russians came out and said that they were chemtrailing and they were chemtrailing in order to stop rain and snow. China, the same thing. Their weather modification office director said that they're doing it, and they're using sulfur, shooting rockets with sulfur in it for the Olympics to stop the rain. So I mean, they're definitely talking about it now. But see, you could see how he's talking about it as if it's theoretical. It's like it's not theoretical. They're doing it, And that's what kind of just drives me nuts. That's why I wrote that story. It's like doublethink. Like they exist, but they don't exist. It's if you're against it, then they don't exist. But if you're unaware of it and you don't know anything about it, well, then they exist. But once you start to realize what it really is, and that it is more about a global carbon tax, and it is more about just experimenting with the planet, then all of a sudden the chemtrails don't exist. So those are the two things I noticed that he talks about as if it's not already happening. To dim the sun a little bit. Has anybody in at least in America noticed where the hell did the sun go? I mean, seriously. Like the last year, just watching it, because I've been paying attention to chemtrails for the past almost 2-3 years now since I've found or realized that they exist, and noticed that dude, even when the sun's out, it's not really out. You can tell that there's like a big blanket of light blue, not that nice, deep blue that you used to see back in the day. It's always like this hazy kind of blue. It's never real, the normal blue that you used to see. So they're already doing it, and it's not just a little tint, it's definitely got some kind of effect that they're, so, but I just want to end up on that, and thanks for checking this out.